These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. The Assyrian destruction of the kingdom of northern Israel is one of the most famous events in world history. But for the Assyrian Empire, it was just another war, the sort it waged every single year for centuries. It didn't start from any great provocation, and if it wasn't for the biblical angle, we would probably know very little about it. But because we have the narrative from both sides, something we almost never get in Mesopotamian history, we get the opportunity to look a little bit deeper at this one historical episode than we normally have. Meanwhile, apologies for the hiatus. The show will be going on, but you will be hearing me plug my Patreon a lot more going forward. So if you didn't know, you can support the show by joining Oldest Stories on Patreon, or by becoming a paid channel member over on YouTube, or by signing up to donate directly on the website oldeststories.net. The show will always be free, but those of you who have been able to support me have really made a big difference in my life, even when the amounts are quite modest. Thank you very much. Our story, then, starts in 734 BCE. Tiglath-Pileser III is king of Assyria, and he's finally stabilized the kingdom after the great sweeping reforms and initial military campaigns of the start of his reign. And this year he's pretty much just looking around, and he has kind of free rein to march his armies wherever he wants. He could go down into Babylonia, but that's politically quite sensitive. He could go east into the Zagros Mountains, but that's a pretty poor country. He could go north against Urartu, but he doesn't yet have the techniques to break their impenetrable fortresses. And so he goes west. There isn't any particular major problem in the West, but, the Levant is quite wealthy, and that wealth is not his, so that's kind of a problem, yeah? So, after the requisite ceremony and omen-taking, he marches his army west, dropping in to the coastal city of Simira, and he looks around and hears about a few minor issues in the region, which he takes as cause for a general reorganization of the entire Levant. Now, something that he had his eye on Gaza pretty much from the start. Then as now, it was on the crucial Egyptian border, and the upper classes of the Assyrian heartland had an increasing fascination with exotic Egyptian culture. Perhaps he wanted better access to trade with Egypt, or perhaps he was already thinking about a conquest of Egypt at some point in the future. But whether or not Egypt was in view, the whole region is weak and unruly and near to the wealthy Phoenician cities and their trade routes, and therefore worth conquering. Anywhere really was worth conquering for an Assyrian as long as they couldn't defend themselves too well. Now, I'll be talking about this campaign as if it has chronology, but it really doesn't. Our sources are very fragmented. We know that it ran from 734 to 732, and quite likely Tiglath-Pileser was on site basically the whole time. But it seems quite unlikely to think that he actually ran the entire army as a single column. Instead, he's brought a huge and massive army into the region. He settled himself in at some temporary capital, possibly Simira, and then he's divided his army up into multiple subunits, attacking different tiny statelets. To send the entire army against any one target here would have been a complete waste of resources. Even the army subgroups who attack multiple places at once turn out to usually be overkill in this story. So, the thing we need to realize is that the Levant is super important to us because there is a very familiar foundational narrative in Western culture that comes particularly from the destruction of Israel and Judah. Now, these wars are a big deal, but as we're going to see, as Tiglath-Pileser and his successors annihilate Samaria, northern Israel, Assyria itself barely notices. It's a modestly prominent state in an absolute backwater. Population estimates for the entire region around Israel, including like the Philistine and Phoenician and desert states like Damascus, are often comfortably under 500,000 people for this whole region in this period. Now, some will estimate a bit over 500,000. I've seen also, on the other end, some people drop it down as low as 250,000 people. And that's for the entire region. Everyone that Assyria will be fighting today, Israel, Judah, Damascus, the Phoenicians, the Philistines, the almost totally insignificant Moabites and Edomites and Amorites. Consider then that the army arriving in this region, it's not numbered in the surviving records, but we would generally estimate that it's at least 10,000 men, possibly as much as 25,000 men. And you have an army that's likely a few percent of the size of the entire population of the Levant. And if altogether, it would have been larger than most of the towns that they were conquering. And this is also perhaps part of why we see the army split up so much. A sparsely populated region is, of course, a sparsely farmed region, which makes logistics more difficult, as a large army is going to need to bring far more with them if they're unable to plunder as much from the surrounding areas. But for all the drama of this campaign, the one thing we don't hear much at all about is any significant military challenge to the Assyrian army in straight battle. Now, like I said, we don't have a good chronology, but most would say that the campaign begins with Arwad. Arwad was allowed to remain independent and not even required to submit in the previous Syrian campaign because it was an island city, like 2 miles off the coast, and Tiglath-Pileser had just too much going on to deal with it at the time. We usually speculate that the real issue is the total lack of an Assyrian navy in the Mediterranean because, of course, they didn't have any actual Assyrian territory on the Mediterranean coast until Tiglath-Pileser's last western campaign. Since last time, however, Assyria has gained control of the Phoenician city of Samarra, and this may have given them access to at least a certain number of boats for hire, if not under their direct control. We don't really hear about Tiglath-Pileser ever having a navy. Indeed, we barely ever hear about even riverboats in the Assyrian context. But of course, they were surely a big part of the logistics. But he has surely at this point had the opportunity to get himself at least a couple of boats. And that plus his total control of the entire shoreline opposite Arwad was enough to force them to submit. In a very damaged part of the record, there may have been a naval invasion launched on the city of Arwad itself, or the king of Arwad, Matan Baal II, could have been caught in one of his mainland cities, which was captured and sacked. Whatever the case, Matan Baal ends up putting on a sackcloth in a show of repentance, and gave a large amount of plunder to Tiglath-Pileser, and suffered that all of his coastal territory would be taken by the larger empire. The island itself was again left independent, but the island itself was unable to feed its population without access to the supplies of the coast, and so Arwad was kept loyal thereafter, but allowed to keep its, Phoenician magic. Thus, the goose that laid golden eggs was domesticated and kept fed without killing it outright, the balance that the Assyrians always tried to strike with these wealthy towns. Moving further south, Hiram II of Tyre and Shipit Baal of Byblos had, in the meantime, fallen under the sway of Damascus. You see, Damascus had become a problem. In a story we actually hear about more from the Bible in 2 Kings and the prophet Amos, Rezin of Damascus, called Rahianu in Assyrian records, had become powerful and convinced Pekah of Israel to join in a coalition. Now, this is often framed as an anti-Assyrian coalition, and indeed there might have been an element of that, but it also seems just like it was a Damascus supremacist coalition, in which Rezin wanted other kings to submit to him in order to increase his ability to make still further kings submit to him. As Tiglath-Pileser looked down the relatively flat Mediterranean coastline where his chariots would have had a significant tactical advantage, he saw Byblos, and then he saw Tyre, and then way in the distance he would have seen Gaza, all of whom had turned towards Rezin of Damascus. And so Tiglath-Pileser marched south in quick order. Now, pretty quickly, we see that Tyre and Byblos were not really true believers in the Damascene cause, or at least not such true believers that they would hold out once the Assyrian army reached their gates. Hiram of Tyre is reported as kissing Tiglath-Pileser's feet and showering him with gifts to insist that the whole Damascus alliance thing, it was all a big misunderstanding, and both major Phoenician trade centers were allowed to maintain their independence, though at the cost of submission and tribute. Now, south of Phoenicia was Philistia, and Gaza, the southern anchor of Philistia, that's the main target here. And yes, Gaza is anti-Assyrian in orientation, and so of course that needs to be violently corrected, and soon enough it is. But Gaza is valuable because it's a fortress, and it is the very best fortress, both for its location and its strength on this side of the Egyptian border. Gaza itself, for some reason, is allowed to remain a vassal, probably because Tiglath-Pileser is now quite far from any other established province. But a bit south of Gaza, the harbor of Gaza is absorbed as an Assyrian territory. That seems a little bit backwards to me, like Assyria would want the fortress city that's been famous throughout the ages and maybe let the port stay independent. That's what I would have assumed, but apparently Tiglath-Pileser knew something that I don't. But of course, that's a good reminder that indeed the kings leading these nations, especially the successful ones, were likely aware of large numbers of things that we're simply ignorant of today, which is one reason I do try to avoid criticizing too harshly, except where such criticisms are funny. Anyway, taking Gaza is a significant step. On one hand, he's now flanked the Damascus Coalition and also cut off their access to the sea, an important step in the campaigns that were either about to start or which perhaps have already started with a different wing of the army. On the other hand, he now has access to the famous River of Egypt. And that gets us to something. What is the River of Egypt? Now, you can always know when you're dealing with a hack, particularly a Bible hack, when they confuse the River of Egypt with the Nile River. Because for sure it does sound like that, but in fact the River of Egypt is barely a river at all. It's a dry wadi that only flows seasonally or occasionally, and it's located somewhere in Sinai. Now, the exact wadi is disputed. Some think that it's the Wadi al-Arish, but whatever specific feature it is, it's somewhere down the coast from Gaza, and it's served as the border since ancient times for the nation of Egypt. Thus, it is the River of Egypt, because when you cross it, you are now in Egypt, much the same way that when you cross the Rio Grande in America, you become more grand because you're now in America. Tiglath-Pileser is not going to invade Egypt. Egypt is not going to invade anyone at all right now, but even though the lords of the Nile don't quite have their act together at the moment, taking over Egypt is a big step that's going to need to wait a while. But what he can do is conquer the near bank of the river of Egypt, and then do a little song and dance right on the Egyptian border to celebrate that he had conquered the entire world, all the way up to the border of distant Egypt. Practically speaking, if his interest was trade in Egyptian goods to satisfy the growing interest in Egypt among the people of Nineveh, then conquering up to the border of Egypt probably doesn't really buy him that much. Most of the trade volumes will have flowed through the Phoenician cities that he's already conquered. But as a symbol for the enduring and infinite power of the god Ashur over the whole of the Middle East region, it is a nice little boost to Assyrian pride. But Tiglath-Pileser realized that the Egyptian border was still, practically speaking, beyond his reach in any consistent way. And so he grabbed a local tribe of Arabs led by a guy named Idibi-Ilu, and designated them as the official protectors of the Egyptian border, supervising the crossing in both directions. Now, this is not a rich area. There won't be any towns here until the Persian Empire founds a strategic town at modern-day Arish to be sort of a border fort. There's some value in an Assyrian presence around Gaza, but the actual river of Egypt can be handed off to random Arab tribes that we never hear from again, because it's not nearly as important in any real sense. So in the next year, Tiglath-Pileser sort of resets back midway up the Levantine coastline, and he moves a bit inward. The main event here is the drama around Damascus, which pulls in some biblical figures as well. Rezin of Damascus has been growing in power, partly because the next strongest kingdom in the local area, northern Israel, had been terribly unstable over the prior decade. Pekah of Israel is king now, but he is a usurper in a series of usurpers, though Assyrian records show Pekah was still claiming or seemed to have been part of the house of Omri. This may have been just a traditional title for them among the Assyrians, who cared very little for the details of Israelite politics. An analogy would be sort of, we call China China because it's named for the Qin dynasty. But of course, it's been quite a long time indeed since Qin Shi Huang was relevant in Chinese politics. Anyway, with Damascus and Israel aligned, they were trying to also convince Ahaz of Judah to join up as well, at which point the Assyrian army arrives in Damascene territory. Now, just because Assyria is the main player here doesn't mean that they're the only ones acting. The biblical account notes that Judah was being dogpiled at the same time as Assyria was entering the region, with attacks from Israel, supported by a Damascene contingent coming in from the north, the Edomites raiding from the east or perhaps south, and the Philistine city of Ashkelon, foolishly believing that the Assyrians had departed for good, attacked from the west. Reading Kings, Chronicles, and Isaiah as if they were ancient Near Eastern histories makes it fairly clear that Judah did not win this fairly brief war and took significant damage, definitely in terms of plunder and captives, possibly in terms of territory, though territorial loss wouldn't persist too much longer. The claims of Chronicles of 120,000 casualties and 200,000 captives is almost certainly either a mistranslation, textual corruption, or scribal hyperbole, as that's probably well beyond the entire population of Judah at this point. And from other records, it seems they only lost a fraction of their people in this war. Numbers just in the thousands seem far more reasonable here. The Bible records the expedition of the prophet Oded to the Sumerian army at this point. The prophet is claimed to have said basically, please return all of our captives. Judah was allowed by God to be defeated in battle, but if you take a bunch of faithful captives, said the prophet, then Samaria will be allowed by God to be defeated in battle. Chronicles suggest that some among the Sumerians were persuaded by this, and if we bring in Assyrian records, then it's quite likely that just as the prophet Oded was negotiating for the release of Judean captives, Tiglath-Pileser was on the march through Damascus. The argument that the Sumerians faced the wrath of God as conveyed through the Assyrian military was probably, in that very instant, quite a persuasive one, as would be the practical concern that the Samaritan army needed its men to not be distracted by shepherding Judean plunder when the survival of the state itself was under threat. The Kings and Chronicles accounts have different focuses, and Chronicles is of course far more polemic in style, but even though these chapters show up often in Bible contradiction lists, if we include Assyrian records, it seems pretty clear that indeed these accounts are consistent, just have different focuses. Judah lost the war that occurred either in 744 or 743, where it was attacked on all sides. But at the same time, it was spared in a larger geopolitical sense, as the dogpile would likely have continued in the following year had the Assyrian army not arrived. Now, how significant was it that Ahaz asked Tiglath-Pileser to intervene in his crisis? We don't really know, but my guess would be probably not that significant. We've seen the Assyrians using the plight of tributary kings in the past as a casus belli, but the Assyrian army seems to have already intended to go pacify this general region anyway, and the diplomacy of Ahaz was likely only a minor factor in the Assyrian army's decisions. Which, ironically, probably justifies the prophet Isaiah's complaints about King Ahaz, as Ahaz probably didn't need to send a bunch of treasure to get Assyria to attack, since they'd already been guided either by geopolitical necessity or, the hand of God to go focus on the region anyway. It's funny how listening to righteous prophets of God's seems to work out for people in all manner of unlikely situations. Anyway, we have very few details about the Assyrian march on Damascus. We usually assume that if we have no details, that it went fairly smoothly, and certainly it was quick. We hear that Rezin of Damascus met the Assyrian army in battle and lost so decisively that he fled the field, entering the gate of the city like a mongoose. Tiglath-Pileser's army encircled Damascus, but again, he didn't have the machinery necessary to assault these stone walls effectively. So they rounded up everyone they could catch outside the walls and then put on a little show, a little song and dance for the defenders of Damascus, in which they impaled Damascene captives alive upon huge wooden stakes and left them to die agonizingly in the sun for hours and hours. They cut off the water supplies to the city and destroyed or plundered as much of the orchards and fields as they could get their hands on, but after only 45 days, they needed to move on. Out of what appears to be pure spite, Tiglath-Pileser sent an army detachment to go find the small village where Rezin of Damascus had been born and burn it to the ground, since they didn't have enough time or resources to take down Damascus itself. Now, the reason for the hurry was that Rezin's desert allies were marching towards Assyrian interests, probably trying to attack an undefended flank to distract and steal plunder. The Assyrian army marched south from Damascus to meet the enemy army in the Transjordan region. Now, this was a coalition army of some note, led by a lady called Samsi, Queen of the Arabs. Now, at this point in history, Arab didn't refer to the entirety of what we would now call the Arabian Peninsula. There was a particular desert region in North Arabia that had a few nice oases that was called Arabi, and this kingdom appears to have been, in fact, a queendom led by a number of women, as we have a few different Arabi queens mentioned in Assyrian records. Nearby to Arabi was Kidri and Keter, a kingdom ruled by good, proper kings, not queens. But these regions were near equal in power, from everything we can tell. But in this case, Samsi was the leader of a coalition of Arab desert people from northern Arabia, and they had made some sort of agreement to join in the fighting on behalf of Damascus. And fight they did, and then they lost near Mount Sakuri, losing 1,000 prisoners and 30,000 camels. So you can really tell that they're Arabs with 1,000 prisoners and 30,000 camels lost at that kind of ratio. They even seem to have taken Samsi's royal tent, plundering some fine aromatics and divine artifacts, while the queen herself fled out into the desert like a female onager, as we're told. All of these animal references go over my head as to the specific details, but this is surely not complimentary. After beating the army and plundering the mobile camp, the Assyrian army went out into the desert to one of the Arab settlements out there and plundered it as well, just to say that they'd done it and convince them all more thoroughly of their defeat. A whole bunch of minor Arab tribes then come to Tiglath-Pileser and offer tribute if he promises not to attack them. And even Queen Samsi shows up with promises to join the Assyrian side. Now, Tiglath-Pileser knows that he has no practical way to control this wretched desert, and so he lets Samsi remain as queen over her little tribal confederation, so long as she promises to be on the Assyrian side. So Assyria now controls the coastal plain, the desert, and has devastated the territory around Damascus. The attack on Samaria either took place at the same time as the attack on the desert or shortly after. The Assyrian army is mostly concerned here with defeating the Samaritan ability to wage war, fighting their army, destroying productive cropland, plundering wealth, people, and livestock, and encircling the capital of Samaria. Again, we see the relative weakness of Assyrian siegecraft yet again, as stone fortresses have quite consistently been able to withstand Assyrian assault under Tiglath-Pileser's new army. And Assyria needs to move quickly, too quickly to afford extended sieges for all of these places. However, once news reached the Assyrian army that a Samaritan captain named Hoshea had killed King Pekah and taken his place, Tiglath-Pileser allowed the new king to sue for peace, taking a big chunk of northern Israel, biting off the portion that would later become the province of Galilee, all the way until Roman times. Then, to close out 733, Tiglath-Pileser had one more stop on his agenda. You see, the very first step in the campaign had been to secure the coastline all the way from Phoenicia to Philistia back at the start of 734. However, once the Assyrian army had moved away, Metinti, king of Ashkelon, had got it in his head that surely the Damascus Coalition was going to defeat the Assyrians, and the prospect of plunder from Judah was very tempting. And so he had backed the wrong horse, breaking his loyalty oath perhaps only months after swearing it. And so, with Galilee secure, the Assyrian army marched towards Ashkelon. The story we have claims that the news of the total collapse of the Damascus Coalition reached Ashkelon right around the time that they also got news of the Assyrian army marching in full force to their city. Supposedly, this news alone was so distressing to Metinti of Ashkelon that he fell into a deep panic attack, went briefly insane, and then died of something that sounds like heart strain. We don't know if the next king, Rukibtu, was his son or some usurper, but we do know that he was very apologetic to Tiglath-Pileser about the whole affair, and after a good deal of groveling and silver, was allowed to become a vassal state. 732, then, was primarily focused on the final phase of the long campaign, the final destruction of Damascus and the death of Rezin. We know that this happened, both because we can infer it from Assyrian records and because the biblical account tells us that, in fact, Damascus was eventually attacked, sacked, and destroyed. The people were deported and King Rezin was executed. However, we don't actually have the part of Tiglath-Pileser's annals that covers this period, even though we once did. Now, here's a little story. In the 1850s, AD, the regular period, a rather famous archaeologist named Henry Rawlinson found part of the slab that had this record, and he wrote in his notes discussing finding it. However, he didn't make a copy of the inscription, and the slab didn't get included in the package being sent to the British Museum. By the time someone noticed that the slab had not been sent, it had gone missing over at the dig site, a victim of archaeological plundering, and it hasn't been seen since. It would be nice to know how the siege progressed, given that the weakness of Assyrian siegecraft under Tiglath-Pileser has been sort of a running theme, and knowing in advance that we will be contrasting it to Sargon's reforms, which are only a few years away now. Anyway, with this final conquest, Assyria now rules the entire Middle East. The Assyrian Empire stretches from the Zagros Mountains to the River of Egypt, from the deserts of Arabia to the Anatolian Mountains. All the civilized flatlands of the Fertile Crescent are, for the first time in human history, under a single tyrannical banner. The kingdom of Assyria is now larger, for the first time in all of recorded history, than the kingdom of Sargon of Akkad at its height. In practice, there are still no shortages of fringes, where the divine god Asher does not gaze quite so often. These are wastelands and mountain fastnesses and swamps and the treacherous hearts of vassals. But at the death of Tiglath-Pileser, in 727 BCE, the world would see the passing of the most successful king that had ever yet come to any throne in all of human history. Assyrian territorial claims had more than doubled in his 17 years on the throne, and the hand of God had worked upon his disobedient people of Israel. Now, I had initially thought to cover the aftermath of this because the continuing story of Samaria's destruction is quite a fun one, but this is going to do for today. Next time, we're going to look at Tiglath-Pileser's far less successful son, and maybe also have time for a bit of his more successful son as well. So join us next time as the Jews stir up trouble for a king who is not equal to the historical moment that he's been called to. Don't forget that you can support the show on Patreon on oldeststories.net or by buying my books, History and Myth from Sumer and Akkad, or History and Myth from Babylon and the Amorites, available on Amazon. Thank you for listening.